Who was Mrs. Astor? Mrs. Astor was arguably noted the most famous and influential woman in Gilded Age society, especially in New York, where she reigned as the queen amongst the upper crust. The phrase, "if you could make it in New York, you could make it anywhere," couldn't have been more true in the Gilded Age. Mrs. Astor was the gatekeeper to this beautiful and wonderful high society life, which only a few important families were let into. If you were new money, you would have to go through her, and she would decide if you would be let into the society or would be kept at bay. Mrs. Astor was born Caroline Webster Schumerhorn, also known as Lena, what she liked to be called. She was born September 22nd, 1830, in New York City. Her family was quite wealthy, and when she was born, her father had a wealth equivalent to $12 million in today's money. She was also the ninth and final child of her parents. On September 23, 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr. William was the middle son of real estate businessman William Backhouse Astor Sr. William Jr.'s grandfather was the famous John Jacob Astor, who made the fortune for his family. The marriage was well suited. She brought the name and pedigree of old Knickerbocker society, while he brought even more money, but no name or pedigree. Together they had 5 children: Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Caroline, and John Jacob Astor IV. Their daughter Helen married James Roosevelt, also called Rosie, who was a diplomat and the elder brother of the future president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. J.J. Astor IV was a very important figure in Mrs. Astor's life, and was also the one who was aboard the Titanic, but he died during the sinking. In Mrs. Astor's early married life, she was principally occupied by raising her children and running her household. She had her own inheritance from her mother and father, and was much less dependent on her husband compared to most women of the day. In 1862, she and her husband built a 4-story townhouse in the popular and understated brownstone style, located at 350 Fifth Avenue. Next door to her home was the home and family of her husband's older brother, John Jacob Astor III. The two families did not get along, although they were neighbors for 28 years. Her other homes included Ferncliff, a country estate located in Rhinebeck, New York, Beechwood, the summer residence located in Newport, Rhode Island, and in the final years of her life, she lived in a double mansion with her son John Jacob Astor IV on Fifth Avenue. When the reigning Mrs. Astor and Mr. Astor had passed away, Lena had decided she wanted to become the new Mrs. Astor and be known as a matriarch of the Astor family and not her sister-in-law. Accompanied and aided by her dear friend Ward McAllister, who often referred to Lena as his Mystic Rose, they solidified proper behavior and etiquette, as well as determining who was appropriate company and who would be let into fashionable New York society. This is why the two of them were often referred to as the gatekeepers, because if you could gain Mrs. Astor's okay and approval, you had everyone else's. In the following decades after the Civil War, there were many new immigrants to New York City, as well as many new families emerging from new money, and not old money. Old Knickerbocker families, which had been there since the original Dutch settlers, would not easily allow any new money families into their ballrooms or dining rooms. They were simply intimidated by the new money families, as these individuals had a great deal more money than them. They also felt that the new money families lacked class, sophistication, and a certain elegance. Mr. McAllister coined the term the 400, referring to the only 400 individuals that were appropriate to associate with in New York City. These 400 were also said to have all fit into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. As Mrs. Astor's children grew older, and her relationship with her husband grew further apart, her involvement in society only increased. She held lavish dinners, teas, and wonderful parties, but one that could not be missed was her annual ball, said to be the finest of the season. She gave her annual ball on the first or second Monday of each recurring January for over a quarter of a century, except for a few select years when she was in mourning over the death of her husband. Caroline Astor's ball was lavish and ceremonial. You went there to not only enjoy yourself, but to be seen by those around you. When Caroline would descend the steps of her beautiful home, it is said that she wore so many diamonds that she shined brighter than that of her chandelier. The mansion was filled with flowers and filled with glittering lights. The music played all night until dawn, and there was a midnight supper at 12 and also a breakfast supper in the morning for those guests that had stayed the entirety of the night. Women wore their most lavish and sumptuous gowns from Charles Frederick Worth, who was the most popular clothing designer among Gilded Age society. By the 1880s, A.T. Stewart built a mansion across the street from Mrs. Astor's brownstone. He owned a premier department store in New York. His home was not of brownstone, but instead was of marble and limestone, and had an appearance of a European chateau. Mr. Stewart was never invited to the Astor Ball in January, as it is said that he was not their kind. It would take another generation before his family began to fit in. In addition, there was a feud between John Jacob Astor III's family, who lived next door, and her husband. There were many differences between the two sides which caused an impending feud. But when John Jacob Astor III passed away, and his wife also did, their son, Willie Waldorf Astor, inherited the home. He desired that his wife become the Mrs. Astor and not his reigning aunt. While he attempted to make his wife the new queen of society, his aunt would not allow it. For this reason, Caroline's nephew wanted to get back at her. So he tore down his family home next door to hers and built instead the Waldorf Hotel, which went on for many years in construction, and then many years with tourists. This caused his aunt to be very frustrated and eventually feeling that she would have to move homes. And so she did. John Jacob Astor IV, her son, and her decided to move further up Fifth Avenue, where together they built a double mansion in the French Renaissance style, where she would occupy the northern residence and him and his family the southern part. Her son also had the idea of turning the lot where her existing home was into a new hotel, to rival the Waldorf. They called it the Astoria, and everything about it was bigger and better. Eventually, the two hotels combined over one management and became the Waldorf-Astoria. Ward McAllister's daughter coined the phrase, "I'll meet you at the hyphen." The hyphen was another term for the hotel. When Mrs. Astor moved into her double mansion, she continued to throw parties and have her annual ball. She stopped, however, on the onset of her dementia, and eventually passed away at the age of 78. Mrs. Astor truly was the queen of New York's Gilded Age high society. While she was alive, it is said that she was not particularly beautiful, nor had ever said anything particularly funny. So the specific reason as to her grave impact and influence over all Gilded Age society is a bit of a mystery to us, but that indeed is part of her historic charm.